The WHFY Empire had been at war for 3,000 years, and they had learned one truth above all others. Victory belonged to those who raised the strongest killers. In the cold darkness of space, far from any sun or planet that might offer warmth, there floated a station called the Fangs of Tomorrow, and inside this station, the Empire grew its future. The cubs arrived as eggs, harvested from breeding mothers who never saw their children and would never know their names. And from the moment these eggs hatched, the young WHFY knew only hunger and pain and the desperate need to survive. Overseer Kethrol had managed the nursery for 40 cycles, and in that time, he had watched thousands of cubs grow from helpless hatchlings into perfect weapons, and he felt pride in this work because he believed he was saving his people. The WHFY were predators by nature, with scales the color of dried blood and claws that could tear through ship hulls and spines along their backs that dripped with venom strong enough to stop a heart in seconds, and their eyes glowed yellow in the dark like small, terrible suns. But nature alone did not make warriors, and so the Empire had built this place to take what nature provided and sharpen it into something unstoppable. The training began on the first day of life. Newborn cubs were separated immediately so they would not bond with their clutchmates, and each one was placed in its own cold chamber where food came rarely and praise never came at all. And the cubs learned quickly that the universe was harsh and that they could trust nothing and no one. By the time they could walk, the fighting began. Handlers would place 2 cubs in a pit, and only one would leave, and the survivor would be fed while the others watched. And in this way, the cubs learned that strength meant survival and weakness meant death. Cohort 12 was Kethrol's finest work. These 300 cubs had shown exceptional promise from their first days, and now, at 2 cycles old, they had already proven themselves in the pits, and their claws were stained with the blood of their weaker siblings, and their hearts had turned to stone just as the program intended. Kethrol watched them through the observation window as they paced their chambers, growling at shadows and snapping at anything that moved, and he saw perfect soldiers waiting to be unleashed upon the Empire's enemies. He did not see children. Had forgotten how to see children on the day everything changed. A transport ship arrived at the station carrying supplies and prisoners, and among the prisoners was a human female named Elena Vasquez. She was small by WHFY standards, barely reaching the chest of an adult warrior, and her skin was soft brown and easily torn, and she had no claws or fangs or venom of any kind. And the guards laughed when they saw her because humans were known throughout the galaxy as weak and fragile creatures, but they were also known for something else. Humans were curious and humans were clever, and humans had a strange talent for surviving things that should have killed them. Elena was a xenobiologist, a scientist who studied alien life forms, and she had been captured during a border skirmish when her research vessel strayed too close to WHFY space, and normally such prisoners were executed or sold, but someone in the Empire's science division had requested her. They wanted to study human biology, and they thought Elena could help them understand why humans were so difficult to kill, despite their obvious physical weaknesses. So, instead of death, she was given work. The station commander assigned her to the nursery as a menial worker, and her duties were simple: prepare the feeding mixtures and clean the waste systems and maintain the environmental controls. And she was never supposed to interact with the cubs directly because that was far too dangerous for someone as fragile as a human. Elena accepted the assignment without complaint because she understood that complaint would only bring punishment, and she had learned in her short time as a prisoner that survival meant staying quiet and staying useful. But she watched the cubs through the observation windows whenever she could, and what she saw made something inside her chest feel tight and painful. She saw babies, not weapons, not monsters, not the fearsome killers the WHFY were trying to create, but babies who cried in the night and flinched at loud sounds and looked at the handlers with eyes that held something the Empire had tried so hard to destroy. Hope the cubs still hoped that someone would be kind to them, and every time a handler entered their chamber, they looked up with that terrible hope. Every time, they were met with cold efficiency at best and cruelty at worst. Elena knew she should not care. And she knew that caring was dangerous, and she knew that these cubs would grow up to kill humans just like her. But she could not stop watching, and she could not stop feeling that tight, painful thing in her chest. On the 37th day of her assignment, the power failed. It happened without warning, as these things often do. And suddenly the station was plunged into darkness, and the automated systems went silent, and the locks on all the doors clicked open. Elena had been in the feeding preparation room when the lights died, and for a long moment she simply stood there in the blackness, waiting for the backup generators to activate. But they did not come on. Then she heard the growling. She was not alone. Door to feeding chamber 12 had opened when the power failed, and now a dozen cubs from cohort 12 were in the room with her, and she could hear them breathing in the dark, and she could smell the sharp scent of their venom, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was about to die. Cubs circled her, and she could see the faint glow of their yellow eyes moving through the darkness like evil stars, and she heard their claws clicking on the metal floor as they drew closer. Elena did not run because there was nowhere to run, and she did not scream because screaming would only excite predators, and she did not fight because fighting was pointless. Instead, she did something that made no sense at all. She sat down on the cold floor and made herself as small as possible, and she started to hum. It was a song her grandmother used to sing, a lullaby from Earth about stars and dreams and being safe in the night. And Elena hummed it softly in the darkness while death circled around her. The growling stopped. One of the cubs, a small one with a torn ear who had clearly lost many fights, crept closer and sniffed at her, and Elena did not move and did not flinch and kept humming that old song. The cub sat down beside her. Then another came close, and then another, and by the time the emergency power finally flickered on 2 hours later, Elena Vasquez was no longer alone and afraid in the dark. She was surrounded by a pile of sleeping cubs who had pressed themselves against her warmth and who were making a sound that no HFY cub had made in 3 generations of the breeding program. They were purring. Overseer Kethril watched the security footage 17 times, and each time he watched it, he felt something cold crawl up his spine. The footage showed a human female sitting in complete darkness, surrounded by 12 of his most dangerous cubs, and it showed those cubs, those perfect killing machines he had spent 2 cycles creating, pressing against her like newborns seeking their mother's warmth. It showed them purring. Kethril had never heard that sound before, and he had to search through ancient records to even understand what it was, because the HFY had bred purring out of their species centuries ago. Purring was a sign of contentment, and contentment was weakness, and weakness had no place in warriors. Yet here were his finest cubs making that forbidden sound while they slept against a soft, fragile human who should have been torn apart in seconds. He did not understand, and that frightened him more than anything. The next morning, Kethril summoned Elena to his office, and she came with her head down and her hands folded because she expected punishment, and she had learned that punishment was best accepted quietly. But Kethril did not punish her. Instead, he asked her what she had done to his cubs, and Elena told him the truth because she had nothing to hide, and the truth was strange enough. She had hummed a song, and she had stayed calm, and she had not acted like a threat, and somehow that had been enough. Kethril dismissed her and spent the rest of the day reviewing everything the Empire knew about humans, and what he found disturbed him greatly. Humans were pack bonders. This was a scientific term that meant humans formed emotional attachments to almost anything, other humans and animals and plants and even machines and objects that had no life at all, and humans would care for these things and protect these things and sometimes die for these things. It was considered a weakness by most species in the galaxy because attachments made you vulnerable, and vulnerability got you killed. But humans had not only survived with this weakness. They had thrived, and they had spread across thousands of worlds, and they showed no signs of stopping. Some xenobiologists theorized that pack bonding was not a weakness at all, but rather the greatest strength humans possessed because it allowed them to form communities and cooperate and build things no single being could build alone. Cathrall dismissed this theory as foolishness, but he could not dismiss what he had seen on the security footage. He decided to run an experiment. He assigned Elena to Cohort 12 as their primary caretaker, and he told himself it was purely scientific, a way to study the effects of human contact on HFY development. But deep in his heart, he wondered if perhaps he was simply curious. Elena accepted the assignment with the same quiet compliance she showed in all things, but inside her chest, that tight, painful feeling grew stronger, because now she would be with the cubs every day, and now she could do something she had wanted to do since she first saw them through the observation window. She could help them. The first days were difficult, because the cubs did not trust her in the light the way they had trusted her in the dark, and they growled when she came near, and they snapped at her hands when she tried to touch them. But Elena was patient. She learned their names, the designation codes the Empire had given them, and she gave them new names, because a number is not a name, and every child deserves to be called something that belongs only to them. The runt with the torn ear she called Patches, and the largest of the group she called Big Sister, and there was one who always watched everything with careful eyes that she called Scout, and one who made the loudest noises that she called Thunder. She gave them all names, and she used those names every time she spoke to them, and slowly the cubs began to understand that she saw them as individuals, as beings worthy of recognition, and not as interchangeable units in a military program. She noticed things about them that no handler had ever noticed before. She saw that Patches had nightmares and would wake in the night shaking and crying in the way that HFY cubs cry, with silent shudders and wide frightened eyes. And when this happened, Elena would sit beside him and stroke the smooth scales between his spines and hum that old song until he calmed. She saw that Big Sister was not aggressive by nature, but had learned to fight hard because she was protecting the smaller cubs and had taken many wounds that should have gone to others. She saw that Scout was brilliant in a way the handlers had mistaken for disobedience, and that Thunder was loud because he was scared, and noise made him feel bigger than he was. She saw them, and in seeing them, she changed them. The cubs began to wait for her arrival each morning, and they began to make the purring sound whenever she was near, and they began to do something that shocked every scientist who reviewed the footage. They began to play HFY. Cubs in the program did not play because play was useless, and useless things were punished, but Cohort 12 started chasing each other without intent to harm, and started wrestling without drawing blood, and started making sounds that could only be described as laughter. Cathrall watched this happen, and he told himself it was contamination, a corruption of his perfect warriors. But he did not stop it because he wanted to see how far it would go. The other cohorts noticed the change cubs in the adjacent chambers pressed against their barriers and watched Cohort 12 with hungry eyes. And they saw Patches and Big Sister and Scout and Thunder fighting. Yes, but fighting over something none of them had ever seen before. They fought over who got to sit closest to Elena. When she sat down to rest, the cubs would push and shove and grumble at each other, not with violence, but with the gentle competition of siblings who all wanted the same prize. And the prize was simply being near her. The prize was being close to someone who cared. Word spread through the station in the way that such things always spread, through whispers and rumors and stolen glances. And soon every cub in the facility knew about the human and about Cohort 12 and about the strange warmth that had entered that cold place. They began to want it. To Elena did not know the effect she was having because she was simply doing what felt right, and what felt right was treating these children with kindness, even though they had been made into monsters. She read to them from her personal tablet. stories from Earth about brave heroes and grand adventures, and the cubs would gather around her in a circle and listen, with their yellow eyes wide and their terrible claws retracted and their venom spines flat against their backs. She taught them words in her language, and they taught her sounds in theirs, and together they built a vocabulary that belonged only to them. She held them when they cried and praised them when they succeeded, and gently corrected them when they made mistakes, and she never, not once, raised her hand against them and the cubs. These children, who had been trained from birth to kill without mercy, began to understand something that the Empire had tried so hard to prevent them from learning. They understood that they were loved. This knowledge spread through them like fire through dry grass, and it burned away the cold stone that the program had built around their hearts, and it left something new and tender in its place. It left hope, real hope this time. Not the desperate, fragile hope of babies waiting for kindness that would never come, but the strong, steady hope of children who had found someone worth trusting. Kethril saw this happening, and he finally admitted to himself that his experiment had gone too far, and that the human had done something he could not undo. She had ruined his perfect weapons by making them feel. He filed his report to the High Command and recommended immediate termination of the human and isolation of Cohort 12, and aggressive reconditioning to undo the damage. The response came within hours. The Empire agreed, and they were sending a team to handle the situation, but they had waited too long, because Cohort 12 had learned many things from their human, and one of those things was that family protects each other, and they had decided that Elena was family. The soldiers arrived on a transport ship painted in the black and red colors of the HFY military, and they brought with them shock lances and restraint foam and neural disruptors, and they had orders to remove the human by any means necessary. Elena did not know they were coming, because no one had told her, and she was in the common area with Cohort 12 when the alarms began to sound. Cubs knew immediately that something was wrong, because they could smell the fear in the handlers who rushed past the observation windows, and they could hear the heavy boots of soldiers marching through the corridors. Patches pressed close to Elena and made a low, worried sound, and she put her hand on his head to comfort him, even though she did not understand what was happening. Then the door opened, and Overseer Kethril entered with 6 armed soldiers behind him, and his face was hard and cold in a way Elena had never seen before. Told her that her assignment was terminated, and that she was being transferred to a different facility, and that she needed to come with him immediately. Elena stood up slowly, and the cubs stood with her, and they formed a loose circle around her without even thinking about it, because that was what family. Kethril ordered her to move away from the cubs, and Elena hesitated because she could see the soldiers raising their weapons, and she understood suddenly that this was not a simple transfer. They were going to take her away, and they were going to do something terrible to the children she had come to love. She said no. It was a small word, barely more than a whisper, but it echoed in the silent room like a thunderclap. Farah's eyes widened, because prisoners did not say no. Humans did not say no, and certainly no one said no to armed soldiers with orders from the High Command. Gave her one more chance to cooperate, and Elena looked at the cubs around her, at Patches with his torn ear and Big Sister with her protective stance, and Scout with his careful watching eyes, and Thunder, who was trying so hard to be brave. She said no again. The soldiers moved forward, and the cubs did something that no one in that room expected. They did not attack. They did not bare their fangs or raise their venomous spines or prepare to fight in the way they had been trained. Instead, they simply moved closer together, closing the circle around Elena, and they sat down one by one, starting with Patches and spreading to the others. They sat down and refused to move. The soldiers tried to push through, and the cubs absorbed the shoves without reacting, without fighting back. And when the shock lances came out and the first painful jolts hit their scales, they still did not move. They whimpered and they cried, and their bodies shook with the agony of the electrical charges, but they did not move. Elena screamed at the soldiers. to stop, and she tried to throw herself between the weapons and the cubs, but Big Sister gently pushed her back into the center of the circle where she would be safe. This was their choice, and they were making it together. Cathrol watched in horrified fascination as his perfect weapons, his killing machines, his future conquerors, demonstrated a kind of strength he had never seen in all his years of running the program. They demonstrated the strength to suffer for someone they loved. The soldiers increased the power on their weapons, and still the cubs held firm, and the sounds of their pain filled the room, but not one of them broke formation, and not one of them lashed out in violence. And then something happened that changed everything. The barriers on the adjacent chambers began to fail. It started with Cohort 11. The cubs, who had been watching Cohort 12 for weeks and learning things that were not in any training program, and they pushed against their barrier until the locks gave way, and then they poured into the Cohort 11, Cohort 10, and Cohort 9, and Cohort 8 all across the station. Barriers were falling and cubs were escaping, and they were not running wild in a frenzy of violence as the handlers might have expected. They were coming to the common area. They were coming to help. Within an hour, there were 300 cubs in that room, all of them sitting in concentric circles around Elena, all of them refusing to move no matter what the soldiers did to them. Cathrol called for reinforcements, but the reinforcements could not get through because the corridors were filled with more cubs, sitting and waiting and blocking every path. The station had become a fortress, and the cubs were its walls. The commander of the soldier team contacted the high command and reported that the situation was out of control and that they would need much heavier weapons to break through. The high command authorized the use of lethal force, but when the soldiers raised their weapons to kill, something shifted in the room. The cubs were still not attacking, but they were no longer passive either, and there was a tension in the air that made the soldiers hesitate, because these were still predators, still dangerous, still capable of terrible violence if pushed too far. One of the soldiers fired. The shot hit a cub from Cohort 9, a young female who had positioned herself at the outer edge of the formation, and she fell with a cry that sounded almost human in its pain. For one terrible moment, everyone in the room held their breath. Then, Big Sister stood up. She walked slowly through the ranks of sitting cubs, her yellow eyes fixed on the soldier who had fired, and she stopped just a few feet away from him. The soldier raised his weapon again, but his hands were shaking because he could see something in her eyes that terrified him. He could see that she was choosing not to kill him. She could have torn him apart in seconds, and they both knew it. And yet she stood there with her claws retracted and her spines flat and her fangs hidden behind closed lips. She was showing him mercy. She was showing him what Elena had taught her. The soldier lowered his weapon one by one. The other soldiers lowered their sketh. Watched this happen, and he felt the foundations of everything he believed crumbling beneath him, because he had spent his entire life teaching these cubs that mercy was weakness. But there was nothing weak about Big Sister in that moment. She was the strongest thing he had ever seen. The soldiers retreated from the room and then from the station, entirely because they could not fight an enemy that refused to fight back, and they could not kill children who were choosing peace. Elena held patches in her arms and wept, because she had never seen such courage, and she had never felt such love, and she had never been so proud of anyone in her entire life. The cubs had been trained to kill, and they had chosen instead to protect. They had been taught that violence was the answer to every problem, and they had discovered that sometimes the greatest strength was the strength to say no, to sit down, to refuse to participate in cruelty. The wounded cub from Cohort 9 survived because the shot had not hit anything vital, and Elena bandaged her wounds with gentle hands while the other cubs watched and learned that caring for the hurt was just as important as preventing hurt in the first place. That night, for the first time in the history of the Fangs of Tomorrow, there was no fighting in the chambers. There was only the sound of cubs purring as they slept in great piles throughout the station. Finally safe, finally together, finally free to be something other than weapons, and at the center of it all sat Elena Vasquez, a small, fragile human with no claws or fangs or venom. But she had something more powerful than any of those things. She had taught monsters how to love, and now those monsters would never be monsters again. The WHFY High Command did not accept defeat easily, and when the soldiers returned with their report of what had happened, at the fangs of tomorrow, the admirals and generals gathered in their great war chamber to decide what must be done. They agreed that the station was lost, and they agreed that the cubs were corrupted beyond repair, and they agreed that the human was the cause of everything. They also agreed that this corruption could not be allowed to spread if word got out that a single human had turned 300 of their finest warriors into peaceful creatures who refused to fight. Then the entire military structure of the empire might begin to question itself, and so they made a decision that would have seemed reasonable to them but would have horrified anyone with a heart. They ordered a battle group to destroy the station completely. 15 warships departed from the Imperial shipyards with weapons hot and orders to leave nothing alive, and they traveled through the dark spaces between stars with grim efficiency on the station. Elena had taken charge in the way that humans often do when there is a crisis and no one else is stepping forward. She organized the cubs into groups and assigned older ones to watch over younger ones, and she found food stores and water supplies. And she made sure everyone was fed and cared for. Handlers had all fled when the barriers fell, and Overseer Catherall had locked himself in his quarters and refused to come out, so Elena was the only adult the cubs could turn to. They turned to her completely. Scout was the one who discovered the approaching fleet, because he had found his way to the station's sensor room and had figured out how to read the displays with his clever, careful eyes. He brought the information to Elena, and she felt her heart sink because she understood what those ships meant. They were coming to kill everyone. She gathered the eldest cubs around her, the ones who had shown the most leadership during the uprising, and she told them the truth because they deserved the truth, even if it was terrible. Patches listened with his torn ear tilted toward her, and Big Sister stood with her arms crossed, and Scout watched with those intelligent eyes, and Thunder was quiet for once. Understanding that this was not a time for noise, they had perhaps 6 hours before the fleet arrived. Elena asked them what they wanted to do, and she asked this because she believed they had the right to choose their own fate. Big Sister spoke first and said they should run, take the transport ships in the docking bay, and scatter across the galaxy where the Empire could never find them all. Scout spoke second and said they should fight, use the station's defenses to damage as many ships as possible before the end. Thunder spoke third and said they should hide, go deep into the station's lower levels where maybe some of them could survive the bombardment. Patches spoke last, and his voice was quiet but steady. He said they should talk. Other cubs looked at him with confusion because talking seemed useless against warships, but Patches had been thinking about this for a long time. He had been thinking about what Elena had taught them. She had not conquered them with weapons or force or violence, and instead she had simply shown them another way to be. And that had been enough. Maybe it could be enough again. Elena felt tears in her eyes because this small cub with the torn ear, this runt who had lost so many fights, had understood something profound. He had understood that the Empire was not their enemy, and fear was their enemy. Fear of being weak. Fear of showing mercy. Fear of choosing peace. If they could show the Empire that there was another way, then maybe, just maybe, they could save not just themselves but everyone. She asked Patches what he had in mind, and he told her, and she felt a strange wild hope bloom in her chest. They had 6 hours. They got to work. Scout led a team to the communication center, and they spent 3 hours figuring out how to broadcast a signal that would reach every ship in the fleet and every world in the Empire. Thunder led a team to the defense systems, and they learned how those systems worked. Not so they could attack, but so they could demonstrate what they chose not to do. Big Sister organized the rest of the cubs into formations that looked impressive on camera, because image mattered in situations like this, and Patches stayed with Elena. and helped her prepare the most important thing of all, her speech. She was not a leader, and she was not a politician, and she was just a scientist who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But she had also been the first person to show these children kindness, and that meant something. It meant everything when the fleet arrived and took up position around the station, ready to unleash enough firepower to turn it into dust. The lead admiral ordered all channels opened, so he could demand surrender before the destruction began. But before he could speak, a signal came from the station, and it overwhelmed every frequency. And it appeared on every screen on every ship. Elena's face filled the displays. Tired and scared, but also determined. And behind her, the observation windows showed the stars and something else. Cubs, hundreds of HFY cubs, standing in perfect formation, their scales gleaming in the station lights, their claws retracted, their spines flat, their eyes calm and steady. The admiral recognized these cubs because he had seen the reports, and he knew what they had been made for, and he knew what they were supposed to become. He did not understand what they had become. Instead, Elena spoke, and her voice carried across the void to every ear that would listen. She said that these cubs had been made into weapons, but that weapons were not what they chose to be. And she said that they had the power to destroy. Yes, because they had been trained well, and the station's defenses were fully operational, and they could hurt the fleet badly before the end. But they were not going to do that. She said that they had learned something better than violence, and they had learned that strength was not about what you could destroy, but about what you could protect. She said that they were going to give the Empire a gift the Empire did not deserve, but needed desperately. They were going to show mercy. The cubs had every reason to hate the Empire, because the Empire had taken them from their mothers and raised them in cruelty, and taught them that love was weakness, and tried to turn them into monsters. But they were choosing to forgive. Elena said that this was the human way. Not because humans were perfect or always merciful, but because humans had learned over thousands of years that revenge only created more pain. She asked the admiral a question that echoed across every bridge and every barracks and every home where the broadcast was being watched. She asked him what kind of future he wanted. Did he want a future where children were raised in darkness and taught to kill without feeling, where the only measure of worth was how much destruction you could cause? Or did he want a future where children could grow up knowing they were loved, where strength meant protecting the weak, where mercy was not weakness but the highest form of courage? The choice was his. The choice was everyone's. Admiral sat in his command chair and looked at the screen and saw a small human woman surrounded by creatures that could tear her apart in seconds, but they were not tearing her apart. They were standing guard around her like she was the most precious thing in the universe, and in their eyes, he saw something he had not seen in a very long time. He saw hope. He gave the order to stand down. The weapons went cold, and the ships held position. And for a long moment, no one quite knew what would happen next. Then one of the captains under his command sent a message asking if he could speak with the human, and another captain did the same, and then communications officers across the fleet were requesting permission to open channels to the station. They wanted to understand. They wanted to learn. Elena sat down heavily in the command chair of the station because her legs would no longer hold her, and Patches climbed into her lap and pressed his head against her chest. She had done it. They had done it around her. The cubs began to make that purring sound, the one that the Empire had tried to breed out of them, and it spread through the station like a song. It was the sound of children who had finally found peace, and somewhere in the fleet, surrounded by warriors who had been trained just as harshly as the cubs. An old admiral heard that sound and remembered that once, long ago, he had been a cub himself. He had purred for his mother before they took him away. He thought he had forgotten that sound forever, but now it was coming back to him, and he wept for the first time in 50 years. 20 years had passed since the day the fleet stood down, and in that time the galaxy had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The Broadcasts from the Fangs of Tomorrow had spread far beyond the military channels, and it had reached every corner of the WHFY Empire, and people had watched a human woman and a group of cubs choose peace when war would have been easier. They had asked themselves the question she posed: what kind of future do we want? The answer had not come quickly, because empires do not change overnight, and there were many who resisted, and many who called the Cubs traitors, and many who wanted to pretend the broadcast had never happened. But the Cubs grew up. Patches became a diplomat, traveling between worlds to negotiate treaties and resolve conflicts without bloodshed. And his tournure became famous across the galaxy as a symbol of someone who had been wounded but had chosen healing over revenge. Big Sister joined the military, but she transformed it from within, and she created new training programs that taught young WHFY to protect instead of destroy, and she never forgot what it felt like to take a shock lance blast while sitting in peaceful resistance. Scout became a scientist like Elena, and he studied the bond between humans and other species, and he wrote papers that were read on 1,000 worlds about the strange power of love to transform even the most hardened hearts. Thunder became an artist, and his sculptures and songs and stories told the tale of the uprising again and again, so that no one would ever forget what had happened and why it mattered. All 300 cubs of Cohort 12 found their paths, and none of those paths led to the violence they had been created for. They became teachers and healers and builders and leaders and parents. Yes, parents, because the greatest change of all was that the war nurseries were closed forever, and WHFY children were now raised by families who loved them and held them and let them purr without shame. It had taken time and struggle, and there had been setbacks and tragedies along the way, but the Empire was no longer the Empire. It was something new, something better, something that the old admirals and generals would not have recognized. And it all started with a human woman who sat down in the dark and hummed a lullaby. On the 20th anniversary of the uprising, a gathering was held at the place where the Fangs of Tomorrow had once orbited, and the station was long gone now, peacefully decommissioned, and its materials recycled into homes and schools and hospitals. But a memorial floated there in the void, a sculpture created by Thunder himself, showing a human figure surrounded by young WHFY in a protective circle. Ships came from across the galaxy to attend the gathering, and they carried diplomats and scientists and artists and soldiers and ordinary people who wanted to witness history. They also carried 300 adults who had once been cubs. Elena Vasquez was old now, her hair white and her face lined with years, but her eyes were still bright, and her smile was still warm. And when her shuttle docked with the memorial station, every single one of her children was waiting for her. They were not small anymore. They towered over her with their red scales and their retracted claws and their flat spines, and they were some of the most powerful beings in known space. But when Elena stepped off the shuttle, they pushed and shoved and grumbled at each other, just like they had when they were cubs. They were fighting over who got to hug her first. Patches won because he always won these competitions, and he had learned over the years that being small and quick was sometimes better than being big and strong. He wrapped his arms around Elena and made that purring sound, and she laughed and cried at the same time, because some things never changed. One by one, they all greeted her, and the ceremony was delayed for almost an hour because 300 WHFY warriors needed their time with their human mother. The galaxy watched this happen because cameras were broadcasting the event across every network. And what they saw was not a political statement or a historical commemoration. They saw a family reunion. When the ceremony finally began, Elena was asked to speak, and she stood at the podium with Patches on one side and Big Sister on the other, and she looked out at the gathered crowd. She said that she had not done anything special. Not really, because she had only done what any person should do when they see a child in pain. She had cared. That was the human way, she said. The thing that made humans dangerous to empires built on cruelty and the thing that made humans valuable. To anyone who wanted to build something better, humans bonded with everything and everyone, and they could not help themselves, and they would die. For creatures they had only known for days, and they would love monsters until those monsters forgot how to be monstrous. She looked at her children, and she told them that they had done the hard part, that she had only shown them the door, and they were the ones who had walked through it. They were the ones who had sat down when every instinct told them to fight, and they were the ones who had chosen mercy when revenge would have been so much easier. They were the heroes of this story. Then she said something that made every HFY in attendance weep. She said she was proud of them. HFY parents did not say this, or at least they had not said it for generations, because the old empire had believed that pride was earned through victory and destruction. But Elena had taught her children a different way, and now they taught their children, and their children would teach theirs. Pride was earned through love and courage and the willingness to be kind, even when kindness was hard. After the ceremony there was a feast, and Elena sat at the center of a long table surrounded by her cubs, who were no longer cubs at all. They told her stories about their lives and their work and their families, and she listened to every word with that complete attention that had first made them trust her in the dark all those years ago. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone home, Patches found Elena sitting alone by a viewport, looking out at the stars. He sat beside her, and she leaned against him like she used to when he was small, and she was the only warmth in a cold world. He asked her if she was happy, and she said yes, more than she had ever imagined possible. He asked her if she had any regrets, and she said only one. She wished she could have saved more of them, the cubs in other programs on other stations, who had never known kindness, who had grown up to be the weapons they were made to be. Patches told her that those cubs were not lost because the HFY, who remained true to the old ways, were a shrinking minority, and every year more of them came to see the truth of what she had taught. Change was slow, but change was real, and it started with one small act of love that spread outward like ripples in water until it touched everything. Elena smiled and took his hand. Her soft human fingers wrapped around his scaled ones, and she told him that this was enough. This moment, this family, this future they had built together. It was more than enough. When Elena died 3 years later, she was surrounded by her children, and they sang to her the lullaby she had hummed in the darkness, the one her grandmother had taught her, the one that had started everything. And across the galaxy, on every world where HFY lived, parents held their cubs close and sang that same song, because that was her legacy, not treaties or reforms or political movements. Her legacy was a song in the dark, and the knowledge that love was stronger than fear, and that sometimes, if you were brave enough and patient enough and kind enough, you could teach even monsters to purr.